Let's begin by remembering that Scott Morrison promised that the stranded Australians would be home by Christmas. That's a broken promise. They were not brought home by Christmas, and many of them are still, of course, stranded overseas, facing the Northern Hemisphere winter. Now, Jane Halton 6 months ago first briefed the Prime Minister about her review of the hotel quarantine system. In that, she made clear the system's unsustainable, it's not fit for purpose, and that the Commonwealth should set up a national quarantine facility with surge capacity to bring the stranded Australians home ahead of the Northern Hemisphere winter. So when I look at Dan Andrews' comments, I see that he's only reinforcing what Jane Halton has said in her review. And that fact that Scott Morrison, who bought himself a trophy to celebrate his own border management, has now abandoned the international borders and shoved that responsibility onto the states. It's no wonder that Dan Andrews and the other premiers are growing frustrated with the lack of a national leadership and a national plan to manage quarantine and the borders.
But Dan Andrews says, he hasn't said anything about state or federal quarantine in this particular statement. He's worried about the more contagious UK variant, and therefore says the numbers of overseas Australians coming home needs to be reduced, and those that come home need to be only accepted on compassionate grounds.
And Laura, if the Prime Minister had done his job, managed the international borders, followed Jane Halton's recommendation 6 months ago to set up a national quarantine facility with surge capacity, those stranded Australians would be home.
But if we find ourselves in this situation now, we have to deal with it now. So with the system that we have, do you agree with Daniel Andrews that only Australians come home that have a compassionate argument?
Well, I understand why Daniel Andrews is making this argument.
But do you
and what
agree
I
with
say
him?
quite clearly, what I say quite clearly, Laura, is that if the Commonwealth government did its job, if they stood up today and said, we're going to do our job, we're going to follow the Halton review, we're going to set up a national quarantine facility that can be appropriately managed to ensure that people can come home safely and the community here in Australia is kept safe from risk, well, I would welcome that. I would welcome that. But the fact that will take some time to set up, and that delay sits on Scott Morrison's head.
Okay,
the fact that people remain stranded sits on Scott Morrison's head.
That with hotel quarantine being run by the states, is your position that the numbers need to be reduced in Victoria, as Daniel Andrews argues, only compassionate grounds?
My position is twofold. One, there should be a national facility, there should be national leadership, and we should have months ago set up, as Jane Halton recommended, safe quarantine facilities to bring stranded Australians home ahead of the Northern Hemisphere winter. Secondly, that we should be following medical advice. And all of the outbreaks and the current lockdowns that we are seeing have been as a result of hotel quarantine. Jane Halton made the point, Laura, that hotel quarantine is not fit for purpose and it's not sustainable. Scott Morrison knew that 6 months ago, and he has ignored it. The problems that exist in hotel quarantine today are because we have not had national leadership to take responsibility here. Let me say this to your viewers, Laura. If you want to bring a horse into Australia, it will go into a national quarantine facility. But if you are an Australian who wants to come home to Australia, Scott Morrison does not want to know you. He has not taken the national leadership required. Now, back in November,
but as the system as it stands, do you
I've said several times the system as it stands is not fit for purpose.
The numbers coming home in hotel quarantine, should they be reduced, as Dan Andrews says, before any kind of federal facility, if or when it's put in place?
Laura, this is a decision that should be taken by the National Cabinet. And what I was just about to say is I asked in the COVID committee last November, I asked the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, if states and territories could unilaterally reduce their quarantine numbers. This is back when Gladys Berejiklian was flagging her intention to do so. And at that point, Prime Minister and Cabinet's officials told me, no, National Cabinet, it's all National Cabinet. It's not.
Who's that on?
Demonstrably,
is that on the
it is
or
not.
The Prime Minister?
That is on the Prime Minister. This is on the Prime Minister, Laura. Quarantine. under the Constitution, is a federal responsibility.
All right,
this is a Prime Minister that bought himself a trophy to celebrate his own border management. He has vacated the space. When we look back at this health crisis, the thing that we will notice is the absence of the federal government. Scott Morrison is the first Prime Minister to shrink the stature of the Commonwealth government during
You bring
a
up
crisis.
biosecurity, and it was interesting because, as you know, I spoke to the Secretary Mike Pizzullo on this program a couple of weeks ago. It's my understanding that the advice from the department was in a pandemic response, that the argument was that the program is to be run by the states for these reasons. One, the states are in control of the borders, and we've seen them shut down those borders unilaterally without much notice. And the second reason is because states run public hospitals.
The state borders, Laura? The state borders, Laura, or the international borders?
No, the state borders.
So we're talking about, you're talking about international borders, and suddenly the department's talking about state borders?
The point is that borders shut down, the state borders, and that states run public hospitals. So if the government at a federal level was to run hotel quarantine, wouldn't it need some oversight and control over those first two things I mentioned?
What a joke, Laura. That is a joke of an argument coming from a government, Scott Morrison's government, that would rather shove all political risk onto someone else. I mean, Scott Morrison's whole focus, whether it is Ruby Princess, whether it is international borders, whether it is quarantine, all matters that are federal responsibilities. His whole thing is, can't somebody else do it? Because Scott Morrison doesn't want the risk. He is too busy looking out for himself to look after ordinary Australians. If we had a Prime Minister that was showing national leadership, and it's hard to imagine that John Howard would have abandoned borders and quarantine to state governments. But that's what Scott Morrison has done. It has been the lack of national leadership that has put Australians, both those stranded overseas and back here in Australia, at greater risk. And if I can say, Laura, the fact that we don't also have a vaccine being rolled out in Australia compounds this problem.
Well, that comes in 2 days' time. Can I just ask you about this hotel quarantine situation?
Laura, the Prime Minister promised 4 million Australians would be vaccinated by mid-March. That is not possible. We are not even going to have enough vaccine in the country by mid-March. This is a triumph, again, Scott Morrison, announcement over delivery.
What's the comparison between New South Wales and Victoria when it comes to hotel quarantine? New South Wales doesn't seem to have had any of the problems of the magnitude that we've seen in Victoria. Is Daniel Andrews above criticism here? Is there something going on?
Look, I think all our premiers, whether they are Liberal or Labor, have taken their decisions and acted in the best interest of their citizens. And the fact that we have gotten through this virus,
but Victoria keeps on stuffing up. That's the problem.
Well, you know, I reflect upon a comment that Patricia Karvalis made on Insiders yesterday, where she made the observation, in some ways, it's also about luck. I mean, I sat and lived through...
So Daniel Andrews is just very unlucky?
No,
is that it?
No, the point being that this is a highly unpredictable virus, which is highly contagious. And in some cases, there has been a bit of luck or bad luck in both ways. Let me make this observation, as I was about to before you interrupted me, that I and my husband lived through the red zone Northern Beaches lockdown through Christmas. Had no family with us over Christmas and New Year's, lived in that lockdown for about 4 weeks. And, you know, that was brought on by Gladys Berejiklian, and I don't complain about the fact that she did that. It was the right decision to take. And it's a similar decision to what Dan Andrews is taking here. Now, there's a bit of luck there that the Northern Beaches outbreak did not become worse, did not spread more widely. But, you know, I come back to the fact, if we had a COVID-safe app that worked, if we had a vaccine being rolled out in Australia, the Prime Minister said we'd be at the head of the queue. There are now some 70 countries ahead of us. America, since the inauguration of Joe Biden, has vaccinated over 26 million people. That is more than the population of Australia. So, you know, we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a COVID-safe app that works, and we don't have a Commonwealth government that is doing its job to manage the international borders.
Gladys Berejiklian has taken 4 times more than international travellers than Victoria. Her risk is heightened. Daniel Andrews has had bigger problems. I just don't see how that works out. That can't just be bad luck.
Well, you know, there are a lot of other aspects to the hotel quarantine system, and I have publicly congratulated and acknowledged that early on, New South Wales government took a decision to have the police directly involved rather than security guards. And I think that has been part of the success in New South Wales. I also think, though, Laura, we need to reflect upon the fact that right across Australia, where we have seen outbreaks, whether it be in aged care or hotel quarantine, a lot of it has come down to insecure work, the fact that people are in casual jobs, they have to work at more than one venue, that there wasn't a pandemic leave. You know, when we look back on this crisis, and as we sit here now facing an industrial relations bill, I think the recognition that casual, insecure work has been part of one of the risks that we have had to manage.
Okay, very quickly, because we're running out of time. Peter Dutton used a private jet to fly to Tasmania during the Braddon by-election. Has he actually broken any rules?
Well, first let's talk about this Safer Communities Grants program. There are no rules. I mean, the Prime Minister set up all these grant programs as Treasurer, community development grants, sports, this Safer Seats, Safer Communities. Absolute ministerial discretion to give away money, often without oversight, guidelines, applications, and at the electorally convenient time. What Peter Dutton has done here, $36,000 for a 24-hour trip. To make a highly political grant in a by-election, grant announcements, standing next to a Liberal Party candidate, grant announcements that his own department didn't support. And, you know, last time I checked back in 2019, you could get a commercial flight from Brisbane to Tasmania, but he chose to spend $36,000. And to put that in context, Laura, the aged care pension is about $24,000, $25,000. He spent 1.5 times what some people have to live on for a whole year for one 24-hour trip to make a highly political announcement in the middle of a by-election campaign. The Liberal Party continues to treat taxpayer money like it is Liberal Party money. And now more than ever, Australians need a government that's on their side.